Cops mock black woman on trial, unaware she's the head of Homeland Security. A tense hush fell over the courtroom as the defendant, a poised black woman in a crisp navy blue suit, stepped forward. Two smirking police officers sat at the prosecution's table, exchanging knowing glances. They were so certain of their victory, certain they would humiliate her for daring to challenge their authority. Little did they know she was no ordinary defendant. Soon the balance of power would shift so dramatically it would leave everyone in shock. Secrets, prejudice, and a looming reckoning all hovered in the charged air. This trial was about to become the most explosive case the city had ever seen. The morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the Marston County Courthouse, reflecting off the polished floors and illuminating the hush that dominated the enormous hallway. Reporters lined up along the walls, armed with notepads and cameras, waiting for any snippet of a sensational story. There had been talk in local media that this was just another routine case. Yet, something seemed different today. An electric charge clung to the air. Spectators arrived in droves, filling the gallery to capacity. Even the bailiffs looked wary, as though they sensed a more profound tension brewing. At the center of it all stood Elise Morgan. She was a refined black woman in her 40s, with high cheekbones and confident dark eyes that reflected a calm no one quite understood. Clad in a tailored navy blue suit, she carried an aura of self-assurance many found puzzling. She arrived with only a small entourage, just her personal legal counsel, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair named Gregory Holtz, and a neatly dressed assistant who remained respectfully in the background. No limousines, no media circus. Elise walked as though she knew exactly where she was going and exactly what to expect. Seated at the prosecution's table were officers Mark Ridley and Dave Thompson of the fictional Westbridge Police Department. Ridley, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, wore a smug grin that distorted the official dignity of his uniform. Thompson was younger, with an intensity in his eyes that bordered on insolent. The pair exchanged smirks while whispering to one another. Their confidence was unmistakable. They had a reputation among certain circles, especially in low-income and minority neighborhoods, for being heavy-handed and often downright hostile. "I've got a feeling this will be quick and easy," Thompson said under his breath. "Can't wait to see her try to talk her way out of this." Ridley just chuckled, crossing his arms. "It's always quick and easy when they try to act tough. Let her squirm." Judge Pamela Whitfield presided in a black robe that carried the weight of the law, her thin-framed glasses perched low on her nose. She glanced through several folders stacked neatly on her mahogany desk. Court employees scurried around, adjusting microphones and seating. The seriousness on the judge's face suggested she hoped for an orderly proceeding, though she might have suspected the energy in the room was anything but ordinary. The charge against Elise, from what the media understood, involved obstruction of a police investigation. According to the official story, Elise had interfered with an ongoing operation run by Ridley and Thompson a few weeks prior, leading to a confrontation that landed her with handcuffs on her wrists. However, hardly any details about the alleged incident had been made public, and from the resolution in Elise's eyes, it was clear there was far more to the story. To casual onlookers, Elise appeared unflappable, but if anyone looked closely, they'd notice the faint tension in her jaw, an indication that she took these proceedings very seriously. Yet in her posture and bearing, there was no trace of fear. Today, the city of Westbridge would learn a secret no one, least of all the arrogant officers, saw coming. As the bailiff finally announced the start of proceedings, everyone settled in. The world seemed to hold its breath. Elise sat at the defendant's table, hands folded, face set in composure. The two officers stared at her from across the room, oblivious to the unraveling shock that awaited them. And so began the trial that would leave an indelible mark on all present, and unravel deep-rooted prejudices hidden behind badges in the law. The trial commenced with a formal air, hushed voices, and the occasional shuffle of feet punctuating the silence. A wave of anticipation gripped the room. Judge Whitfield welcomed the jury, a motley group of men and women who seemed, at least on the surface, impartial. Some looked bored, still blinking away morning fatigue. Others seemed intrigued, sensing that this wasn't a routine day in court. The prosecution's team, led by Assistant District Attorney Colleen Marshall, rose to deliver a crisp statement. She portrayed Elise Morgan as a brazen individual who had purposefully and maliciously interfered with a legitimate police operation in progress. Marshall's tone was professional, but there was a subtle condescension laced through her words, as though speaking about Elise as if she were a nuisance or a reckless vigilante. Ridley and Thompson nodded in agreement at each rhetorical beat, their smugness unwavering. Elise remained calm, occasionally glancing at the jury. She saw a few receptive faces, but also recognized the subtle biases that might be lurking beneath. She had been in enough high-stakes environments in her life to know how to read a crowd. The quietly pursed lips, the slight stiffening of postures whenever her identity was mentioned, these were silent signals hinting that prejudice was closer to the surface than many would care to admit. Gregory Holtz, Elise's defense attorney, stood up next. He was a legend in the legal circles of Westbridge, renowned for his unflinching pursuit of justice. Now graying with lines etching his face, he nonetheless exuded a fatherly warmth. In his carefully modulated voice, he promised the jury a clearer picture of what truly transpired. He also teased that there were unique circumstances surrounding his client that should compel everyone to question the story spun by these officers. For the past few weeks, you've only heard the prosecution's narrative in the media, he stated, looking each juror in the eye. You've been told Miss Morgan obstructed a police operation, but keep an open mind. We believe you'll find that Officers Ridley and Thompson used unlawful methods, employed intimidation tactics, and targeted Miss Morgan for reasons that go well beyond proper policing. At the mention of unlawful methods and intimidation, the officers shifted in their seats. Ridley's smug grin faltered for a heartbeat, only to be replaced by a sneer. Thompson drummed his fingers on the table, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Once opening statements concluded, Judge Whitfield declared a short recess before the first witness would be called. That gave the room's tension a chance to breathe. The prosecution retreated to a side bench, conferring in hushed tones. Ridley couldn't resist throwing a derisive glance at Elise, mouthing something that might have been an insult. Thompson merely smirked. Meanwhile, Elise sat in calm conversation with Gregory. To any observer, she was just a well-dressed defendant, occasionally trading polite smiles with her counsel. But beneath her measured demeanor, she could feel her adrenaline spike each time the officers made a snide remark under their breath. It took every ounce of her self-control not to unleash the truth right then and there. She wanted to see how far Ridley and Thompson would take their charade before fate turned on them. In the corridor, a few reporters snapped photos of Elise as she made her way to a water fountain. She offered no comment, only a polite smile and a slight raise of her hand. The assistant at her side, a discreet young woman named Tiana, kept watch, ensuring the press didn't get too intrusive. Tiana knew her boss's plan, knew exactly who Elise Morgan truly was. This trial wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about rectifying a vile pattern of corruption and racism embedded within certain ranks of the police department. The city's people deserved better, and Elise was determined to see justice done. As the judge's gavel signaled the end of the recess, the atmosphere stiffened again. Gregory was ready to call his first witness, while the prosecution waited confidently, as if they already held every card in the deck. Elise allowed herself one deep breath, fixing her gaze on Ridley and Thompson. Their day of reckoning was coming, and soon the entire courthouse and the entire city would bear witness to how quickly arrogance and prejudice can be toppled by truth. Before the first witness took the stand, Gregory requested permission to show footage from the day Elise was arrested. Judge Whitfield granted the motion. The lights dimmed, and all eyes turned to the overhead screens affixed to the courtroom walls. In grainy black and white surveillance footage, they saw a late afternoon scene unfold in a quiet residential neighborhood of Westbridge. A series of police cars lined the curb outside a modest house. Officers were milling about, some with clipboards, others standing guard. The camera's angle shifted to reveal Ridley and Thompson approaching a figure on the sidewalk, Elise Morgan. She was dressed in casual clothes, returning from what looked like a community event. The camera had no sound, but it captured gestures and body language clearly. In the footage, Elise appeared composed but concerned. She seemed to be asking the officers questions, possibly about what was happening in her neighborhood. Ridley and Thompson, based on their exaggerated arm motions, appeared dismissive, maybe even aggressive. Elise held out her palms defensively, stepping back. An argument ensued, still silent on the video. Suddenly, Thompson yanked out a set of cuffs and lunged at Elise. Ridley stood close by, leaning in, clearly threatening her with his posture. Inside the courtroom, the hush grew heavier. Elise's face remained calm, but her eyes flickered. For many on the jury, this was a first glimpse at the actual confrontation. If Elise had truly obstructed a police operation, the video didn't conclusively show it. Instead, it showed her being cornered. The defense paused the video at the moment Elise was pinned against the hood of a police cruiser, her hands forcibly cuffed behind her back. Gregory stood, his voice measured. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this footage merely scratches the surface. You see Miss Morgan asking questions, stepping back. No sign of a struggle. No sign of her interfering with anything other than inquiring about the presence of so many officers in her neighborhood. You see the immediate escalation from conversation to force, yet the prosecution claims she was aggressively obstructing their operation. Are you seeing that here?" ADA Marshall cleared her throat, preparing to counter. But before she could speak, the lights came back on and Gregory continued. "We plan to call eyewitnesses who will testify to what Miss Morgan actually said. Words of concern for a neighbor whose house the officers targeted under questionable circumstances." After a brief sidebar, the judge allowed the defense to proceed with their witness, a local resident named Carmen Williams. Carmen, a retired schoolteacher and longtime neighborhood watch volunteer, had been walking her dog that day. She described in vivid detail how Elise approached the officers politely. Carmen explained Elise recognized the woman living in the targeted home, an elderly lady, who recently complained of police harassment. Carmen saw no aggression from Elise, only confusion. "They just grabbed her," Carmen testified, her voice trembling slightly. "They called her all sorts of names under their breath. I can't repeat them in this court, but it was shocking. She did nothing but ask questions. Next thing I knew, she was on the hood of that cruiser." In that instant, Ridley shifted uncomfortably. Thompson's jaw tightened. Their expression screamed a desire to discredit this witness. Yet Carmen's unwavering tone and the sincerity in her eyes made her testimony compelling. The jury took notes, occasionally glancing at Elise to gauge her reaction. When Marshall cross-examined, she tried to paint Carmen as an unreliable witness. She suggested that Carmen might have poor eyesight due to her age, or that she might have personal bias. But Carmen held firm, clarifying that she only needed glasses for reading, and had been a staunch supporter of fair policing her entire life. She also recounted how the officers had scoffed at Elise, making remarks about people like you meddling in grown folks' business. As Carmen concluded her testimony, a ripple of unease passed through the prosecution's table. The idea that racially charged language might have been used was a potent new factor. Neither Ridley nor Thompson dared look at the jury as Carmen stepped down. For the first time in the trial, there was a crack in the officers' fortress of arrogance. They glanced at Elise, who calmly observed the proceedings. She still had not revealed her true identity. The stage was set for even more explosive revelations, ones that would rattle the pillars of the courthouse and the entire Westbridge Police Department. During the lunch recess, the courthouse corridors buzzed with speculation. Journalists clustered in corners, whispering theories about the footage and Carmen Williams' testimony. Some recalled rumors of questionable actions by Ridley and Thompson in the past, investigations into complaints that never went anywhere. How many times had these officers walked away unscathed? And who was Elise Morgan really, that she would stand up so fearlessly against them? Elise and Gregory retreated to a small conference room, where her assistant Tiana guarded the door from prying ears. A hush fell as Gregory gathered his notes. "Carmen's testimony was solid," he said, glancing at Elise with a proud nod. but they'll discredit her if they can. We need more than eyewitness accounts. We'll need to reveal your position at some point, won't we? Elise sighed, straightening her posture. We will, but not yet, she said quietly. I need them to continue underestimating me. I want to see how far they'll go to lie under oath. Gregory rubbed the bridge of his nose. This is risky. The prosecution will blindside us with anything they can, but if we reveal the truth at the right moment, it could be a game changer. Once the court learns you're the newly appointed head of the Department of Homeland Security, those officers will have no escape. Elise nodded. Precisely. But the goal isn't just to win my case. We need accountability. If we expose them prematurely, they might cut a deal or the department might try to bury evidence. Timing is everything. Tiana stepped forward, clearing her throat politely. Ma'am, I've arranged for a secure call with Deputy Secretary Lawson. He wants an update on the situation. Elise thanked her assistant with a gracious smile, then turned to Gregory. Can we trust the system here to deliver justice once they learn who I am? I've seen how the wheels of bureaucracy turn, slow and sometimes crooked. Gregory leaned in, eyes earnest. I've been fighting corruption in Westbridge for decades. I've seen how rotten some corners of the city can get. But the moment it becomes a federal matter, especially under Homeland Security's lens, they can't sweep it under the rug. And if the city officials try, there will be far bigger legal ramifications. We're talking civil rights violations at a federal level. Elise's gaze hardened. She knew the significance of her role, but it pained her that she had to use such leverage to protect her basic rights. She reflected on how many ordinary citizens didn't have these avenues of power. How many others had been pinned to police cars like she was, people who didn't have the means or status to fight back. Meanwhile, in another corner of the courthouse, Ridley and Thompson were huddled with ADA Marshall. Their voices were low but tense. The officers insisted that Carmen's testimony was hearsay from an old bat. They maintained that Elise was the aggressor, claiming she used threatening language. However, they had no substantial video or audio evidence to prove it. The so-called dashcam footage conveniently had technical issues, while the body cams they wore had either malfunctioned or lost battery at crucial moments. Keep it together, Marshall hissed. She recognized the risk that repeated claims of malfunctioning body cams would look suspicious. Yet she also needed to present a united front. We'll find a way to discredit that video, and even if the judge allows it, we'll call enough witnesses from the department to back up your version of events. Right, Thompson muttered, though his voice wavered. We have to win. I'm not letting some mouthy troublemaker upend my career. Ridley clapped a hand on Thompson's shoulder. Relax, we've seen worse, Dave. At the end of the day, no jury's going to believe a random civilian over two decorated officers, especially not someone like her. Marshall glanced over her shoulder, lowering her voice further. Just watch it with the remarks, Officer Ridley. This is a sensitive trial. We can't afford any slip-ups that hint at racism or prejudice. Understood? Ridley shrugged, but nodded. His expression, however, betrayed neither remorse nor caution. Their entire plan revolved around the assumption that no one could best them in court. They certainly had no idea who Elise really was, or that her influence reached far beyond Westbridge. As the lunch recess ended, both sides prepared to resume. Elise returned to her seat, posture graceful, face calm. Thompson and Ridley sent her unspoken glares, and above them all, the ancient clock on the courtroom's wall ticked steadily, counting down to the moment when a long-buried truth would finally explode into the open. And with it, the arrogance of two officers who never expected the tables to turn so dramatically against them. Once the proceedings reconvened, Judge Whitfield called the court to order. The prosecution aimed to reassert their narrative, calling Officer Thompson to the stand. The young cop walked confidently, uniform crisp, eyes set on the jury. He had practiced his testimony, hoping it would be the linchpin that confirmed Elise Morgan's alleged obstruction. Thompson's version was carefully crafted. He recounted a tale in which Elise approached them aggressively, demanding they halt their investigation. He claimed she yelled curses and threatened to call her people to make them back off. According to Thompson, Elise then tried to push him, prompting him to defend himself. Gregory rose for cross-examination. "Officer Thompson," he began, scanning a sheet of notes. "You claim Miss Morgan physically pushed you. Could you point out where on the surveillance footage we just watched that occurs?" Thompson squared his shoulders. "It wasn't caught on that camera. It happened after she moved off camera. You can't see it." Gregory arched an eyebrow. "Yet the footage shows her backing away from you, and within a few seconds you had her handcuffed. Are you suggesting that she managed to push you in that very short interval, unseen by the camera?" Thompson sniffed, nodding. "She was quick. Cameras don't catch everything." A ripple of skeptical laughter passed through the spectators, quickly silenced by the bailiff. Thompson's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his stance. Gregory continued calmly, pressing on the point of conveniently off-camera behavior and the suspicious failure of multiple body cams. "If your camera malfunctioned, do you have any documentation? Maintenance logs or notice of malfunction?" Thompson fumbled for a moment. "There was a glitch. We reported it. Those forms are with the department's tech unit." Gregory gave a polite, tight-lipped smile. "I see. We requested those logs but haven't received them. I trust they'll be forthcoming, or else we might question whether they exist at all." The jury was clearly taking note of the policeman's evasiveness. Thompson tried to look unruffled, but a thin sheen of sweat appeared along his hairline. Next, ADA Marshall directed the conversation to shift focus, asking Thompson about his years of service, any commendations he received, and how he was dedicated to safeguarding the community. Thompson leaned into his performance, waxing poetic about the challenges of law enforcement. His words aimed to paint him as a dedicated officer who had no reason to target innocent civilians. In describing his noble work, he subtly implied that Elise, being a civilian, had no business questioning police procedure. Yet the arrogance underlying his words didn't escape the jury's attention. After Thompson stepped down, Ridley was called. The older officer tried to bolster Thompson's story. His testimony mirrored that of his partner, but he added an extra layer of supposed threats Elise had made, claiming she'd said something about bringing federal wrath down on them. Gregory and Elise exchanged a knowing glance. Clearly, Ridley was fumbling into territory closer to the truth without realizing it. Still, it was twisted. Ridley's insinuation was that Elise was some delusional person. The irony was thick in the air. He had no idea how accurate that federal wrath reference would become. When cross-examined, Ridley also had a weak explanation for the missing body cam footage, this time blaming a battery issue. Gregory pressed him on the frequency of such malfunctions occurring simultaneously in a single operation. Ridley grew defensive. "It happens," he grumbled, crossing his arms. "These cameras aren't perfect." Throughout Ridley's testimony, Elise remained quiet, observing how the officers, so secure in their prejudice, twisted every detail to frame her as a hostile nuisance. The tension in the courtroom became almost palpable. Some spectators, especially those who had experienced racial profiling, seethed in silence. Others wore skeptical expressions, suspicious that the story from Ridley and Thompson was too convenient. By late afternoon, after a grueling day of witness testimonies and cross-examinations, Judge Whitfield adjourned the session. She urged all parties to be ready for more evidence and witnesses on the following day. As people filed out, the two officers exchanged relieved glances, thinking they had held their ground. ADA Marshall seemed less sure, noticing the seeds of doubt creeping into the jury's expressions. Elise walked out with Gregory, Tiana by her side, grateful for the fresh air. Tomorrow, Gregory would start to dismantle the officers' testimonies even further. And if need be, Elise knew she could deliver the blow that would turn the trial upside down. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person of color in Westbridge who had ever been silenced by those sworn to protect and serve. The next morning, an air of expectancy shrouded the courthouse. Word had spread about the footage and the conflicting testimonies. Crowds assembled outside, some holding signs advocating for police accountability. The tension now extended beyond the courtroom walls into the city itself. Inside, Gregory arrived early with Elise and Tiana. Elise noticed a group of community leaders waiting near the benches. Among them was Reverend Samuel Tillman, a respected clergyman known for his work in civil rights advocacy. The Reverend had heard rumors about Elise's case and decided it was time to show support. Beside him stood an unexpected ally, Karen Donahue, a well-known conservative columnist who had previously championed law and order stances. However, Donahue had recently confronted her own experiences with the Westbridge PD's unethical practices after her teenage son was wrongfully stopped and frisked. That incident opened her eyes to the prejudice many lived under every day. Gregory approached them, extending a polite handshake. "Reverend Miss Donahue, we appreciate you being here." Elise nodded in greeting, her stoic face warming slightly at their presence. These surprising allies gave her hope that maybe the city was ready to confront the systemic issues, if only the truth saw the light of day. Soon, court resumed. The defense called Dr. Yvonne Gardner, a clinical psychologist specializing in the psychological impact of racial profiling, as an expert witness. She provided testimony explaining how repeated encounters with biased law enforcement erode trust in institutions, often leading citizens, especially those from marginalized communities, to question police motives. Elise watched the jury absorb Dr. Gardner's words, some nodding slowly. Throughout the psychologist's testimony, Ridley and Thompson wore scowls, exchanging irritated glances. They seemed to grow more restless by the minute. Gardner's testimony, though not directly about them, painted a broader picture that implicated practices akin to those the officers were accused of. It was a subtle yet potent maneuver by Gregory, helping the jury see that Elise's reaction on the day she was arrested could be the result of long-standing systemic issues, rather than any inherent aggression. Then came a pivotal moment. Gregory called Sergeant Miguel Trevino of the Westbridge PD as a defense witness. Trevino was a man of few words but known within the department as an honest officer. He hesitated at first but had agreed to testify under subpoena. "Sergeant Trevino," Gregory asked, "were you present at any point during the incident involving Miss Morgan?" Trevino nodded solemnly. "Yes, I arrived shortly after the call for backup was made. I saw Miss Morgan in cuffs in the back of a patrol car. She looked shaken. I also noticed the body cams on Officers Ridley and Thompson were powered off. I asked if they had footage. They told me no." Gregory pressed gently. "Did that strike you as odd?" "It did," Trevino admitted, casting a wary glance at Ridley and Thompson, who stared daggers at him. "Protocol requires body cams to be active in any interaction with the public. They told me it was a malfunction, but that seemed suspicious since both had the same issue at once." When Gregory asked if Trevino had ever witnessed Ridley and Thompson use excessive force or racist language, the sergeant's posture stiffened. He hesitated, perspiration forming on his brow. Yes, I have heard them use slurs. I've filed internal complaints, but nothing ever came of them." A hush fell over the courtroom. Ridley's face reddened to a furious shade, and Thompson stared at Trevino like a predator sizing up its next meal. ADA Marshall attempted to discredit Trevino, suggesting he held a grudge. But Trevino kept his answers short and factual. The damage was done. At the gallery's back, Donahue scribbled furiously on a notepad, while Reverend Tillman pressed his lips together in grim acknowledgement. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Even Judge Whitfield's expression was tinged with worry, as though she was only now grasping the depth of the issues at hand. During a short break, the hallway buzzed with conversation. Some people approached Trevino, thanking him for his courage. Others murmured about the ramifications for the Westbridge PD if Trevino's testimony was corroborated by further evidence. Elise stood quietly beside Gregory, her mind racing. The tide was turning. Where once the officers sat smugly, certain that their uniform granted them impunity, their foundation was starting to crumble under their own falsehoods and bigotry. Yet, Elise knew this was just the beginning. The real knockout blow would be her identity as the newly appointed head of Homeland Security. She had no illusions that revealing it would fix everything overnight, but it would force the entire system to reckon with what had happened here. Justice was inching closer, but the final confrontation still loomed, and Elise felt the heavy burden of what must be done to ensure no one else had to endure the humiliations she had faced at the hands of those sworn to protect. By the end of that day, the prosecution's once confident facade was in disarray. Witness after witness for the defense painted a pattern of misconduct, not just in Elise's arrest but in earlier incidents involving Ridley and Thompson. The jury became more attentive, some wearing expressions of disgust as details emerged of how the officers had historically dealt with minorities. There were accounts of traffic stops that escalated into unwarranted searches, young black men roughed up for merely asking questions, and a consistent narrative of intimidation tactics. Elise and Gregory had carefully curated these witnesses, people who had either lodged formal complaints or witnessed questionable policing. None of them had found justice because those complaints apparently vanished in the Westbridge PD's internal processes. Now, under oath and with public scrutiny, these hidden truths could no longer be conveniently dismissed. During a particularly tense moment, Gregory presented departmental records obtained through a subpoena. These documents indicated that Ridley and Thompson had more complaints filed against them than 90% of their peers. In the margin, multiple notes from Internal Affairs simply read, "Case closed, insufficient evidence." The repeated pattern was impossible to ignore. The prosecution attempted a feeble defense, suggesting that as active officers working in high-crime areas, it was normal for them to accumulate numerous complaints. But even the jury could see this explanation falling flat. Each piece of new evidence eroded the credibility of the officers. Their earlier confidence had all but evaporated. In the gallery, public opinion was visibly shifting. Ridley grew more sullen with every damaging revelation, while Thompson's face occasionally flared with anger. The same man who had boasted about making short work of "this woman" was now clenching his jaw. Tension radiated from him. His foot tapped restlessly under the table, a testament to rising panic. Outside the courthouse, local news channels were broadcasting daily updates. Interviews with community members revealed anger and frustration, especially among black residents who felt vindicated at last. Others voiced concern about letting one-sided stories shape public opinion, still clinging to the notion that the police were beyond reproach. Social media exploded with commentary. Hashtags like #JusticeForElise and #WestbridgeTruth trended locally. Gregory, now fully in his element, sensed the momentum, but he warned Elise privately, "We're on solid ground, but let's not underestimate the prosecution or the power structure in this city. I've seen last-minute attempts to bury the truth. We need to remain vigilant." Elise agreed, acknowledging the precarious nature of their progress. Though she was itching to drop the bombshell of her identity, she trusted Gregory's pacing. He wanted the jury and the public to see the injustice for themselves, without overshadowing it by her rank. Once they comprehended the full scope of the officer's deceit, they'd be all the more shocked when they learned who Elise really was. That evening, as Elise returned to her hotel suite, she set down her briefcase and scanned through updates from Tiana. The Department of Homeland Security had authorized additional resources should she need them. She also had a voicemail from Deputy Secretary Lawson, checking on her well-being. A pang of bittersweet emotion threaded through her. The top brass in Washington were ready to defend her, but so many citizens in Westbridge lacked any such safety net. Elise gazed out the window at the city lights. She recalled her upbringing in a small southern town, where she first felt the sting of discrimination. She'd vowed then to break barriers so that others wouldn't have to feel powerless. Over the years, that vow led her to climb the ranks of law enforcement oversight, culminating in her nomination as head of Homeland Security. Now, ironically, she was forced to experience the same brand of injustice she'd spent her career trying to dismantle. Despite the turmoil, Elise allowed a small smile to form. Things were changing. The truth was coming out. Tomorrow they'd continue chipping away at the prosecutorial facade, inching closer to the moment of reckoning. Ridley and Thompson had no inkling of just how severely their choices would boomerang back. And Elise was ready to usher in the justice that had been denied to so many for far too long. On the fourth day of the trial, the courthouse was more crowded than ever. The line of people waiting to enter stretched around the block. Both local and national news crews had arrived, sensing a major story. Whispers circulated that something monumental was about to happen. Even the bailiff stood on edge, scanning the throng for potential disruptions. Inside, the trial resumed with the defense's star witness, Elise Morgan herself. The tension escalated as she walked to the witness stand, every eye locked on her. Some doubted she had anything significant to add beyond personal testimony, but others sensed she was about to drop a bombshell. Judge Whitfield instructed Elise to raise her right hand. After she swore to tell the truth, Gregory began his questioning. "Miss Morgan, could you please tell the court about your background?" Gregory's tone was calm, offering no hint of what was to come. Elise clasped her hands in her lap. "Certainly. I grew up in South Carolina. My father was a pastor and my mother was a school principal. We lived in a community deeply impacted by racial discrimination, and I saw firsthand how law enforcement could sometimes treat black communities unfairly." A couple of jurors leaned forward, intrigued. Elise continued, "I pursued a double major in criminal justice and political science. I then joined a federal agency, initially the FBI, where I specialized in counterterrorism and later civil rights investigations. After several years, I transitioned to another federal body, focusing on national security policy." She paused, looking at Gregory. He nodded, encouraging her to proceed. The gallery buzzed, some people glancing at each other in confusion. Elise's resume already dwarfed what they'd assumed for a random defendant. She cleared her throat softly. "Eventually, I accepted a presidential appointment within the Department of Homeland Security. I served as Deputy Director of Intelligence before receiving my most recent role." A hush blanketed the courtroom. Even Ridley and Thompson seemed momentarily stupefied. Gregory exhaled, bracing for the impact. "And that recent role is?" he gently prodded. Elise met his gaze, then turned to address the court directly. "I am currently the newly appointed head of the Department of Homeland Security." The silence was deafening, punctured only by an audible gasp or two from the audience. A few camera shutters clicked, reporters capturing the moment. The jury stared, mouths agape. Judge Whitfield leaned forward, adjusting her glasses as if doubting what she had heard. Pandemonium erupted in the gallery. People whispered and murmured among themselves. Ridley's eyes widened in shock. Thompson went pale as though he'd been struck by lightning. ADA Marshall, to her credit, attempted a composed demeanor, but her complexion betrayed her astonishment. This was not merely a random civilian. This was a powerful figure at the federal level. Gregory waited until the outcry subsided. "So, Miss Morgan, on the day you were arrested, did you have any intention of hindering a legitimate police operation? Or were you simply concerned about a potentially unlawful raid in a neighborhood you were visiting?" With her voice steady, Elise responded, "I had no intention of obstructing anything. I saw what looked like an overreach and was worried about the rights of the homeowner. My concerns weren't personal, they were professional. I've dedicated my life to protecting citizens' rights while ensuring national security." A trembling hush settled again. The jurors carefully studied Elise, wrestling with the magnitude of her testimony. The prosecution looked flustered, well aware this revelation obliterated their portrayal of Elise as a hostile meddler. And in the seats designated for the accused officers, Ridley and Thompson exchanged terrified glances. The woman they had manhandled and mocked was actually one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the nation. For a moment, the gravity of what they'd done hung palpably in the air. They'd forcibly arrested someone who was not just an ordinary citizen, but a key federal official, and their excuses about body cam malfunctions were now laughable in light of the scrutiny that was sure to come from higher authorities. Ridley's hands gripped the armrest of his chair, knuckles turning white. Thompson looked away, unable to maintain eye contact with anyone. Their bravado had vanished. There was no going back now. Elise's truth had finally come out, setting the stage for a dramatic finale. The entire courtroom realized that this case was no longer just about whether an individual had obstructed a local police operation. It was about systemic discrimination, abuse of power, and blatant racism laid bare before the nation. And for Ridley and Thompson, the day of reckoning had arrived in a form they'd never dreamed possible. The courtroom revelation that Elise was the newly appointed head of Homeland Security rippled through Westbridge and beyond. Within hours, the news trended on major networks and social media. Commentators debated the implications. Legal analysts weighed in on how this case could reshape public trust in law enforcement, and civil rights organizations hailed Elise as a hero for shining a bright light on systemic issues. But no one felt the impact more than the Westbridge Police Department. Suddenly, the chain of command was thrust under a glaring spotlight. Why were complaints against Ridley and Thompson consistently dismissed? Who authorized or ignored their questionable tactics? The mayor's office scrambled to address the PR firestorm. The chief of police held a tense press conference, assuring the public that an internal investigation was already underway, and pledging full cooperation with any federal oversight. Skeptics pointed out that such promises rang hollow without concrete action. For Ridley and Thompson, life had turned into a nightmare. Their faces were plastered on the local news. Protesters appeared outside the courthouse each morning, holding signs condemning racism and police brutality. The officers could hardly leave the building without being jeered at. Their families were harassed, and their circle of friends dwindled as people distanced themselves from the scandal. The armor of the badge, which had once seemed impenetrable, was now riddled with cracks. In a last-ditch effort to salvage their case, ADA Marshall filed a motion to exclude certain evidence related to Elise's federal position, arguing it was prejudicial and irrelevant to the specifics of the arrest. Judge Whitfield denied the motion, pointing out that Elise's role in law enforcement oversight was directly pertinent to her reasons for questioning their actions. Marshall was left with few cards to play. Amid the chaos, Elise kept her composure, yet she recognized the deep weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She'd never wanted to use her office as a weapon, but in a system that so often tilted against people of color, shining the full light of federal authority was sometimes the only way to break the cycle. Gregory methodically continued to present evidence, each piece further dismantling the officers' stories. Emails showed Ridley complaining about too many outsiders moving into certain neighborhoods. Thompson had once forwarded a racially insensitive meme to colleagues. While such digital footprints might not prove direct malice, they added up to a damning portrait of officers who harbored deep-seated biases. And when challenged on the stand, both men fumbled to justify their words and actions. The reaction in the courtroom was visceral. Some jurors looked appalled, while others tried to mask their shock. Meanwhile, spectators in the gallery shook their heads or muttered angrily under their breath. Even the judge's calm judicial mask slipped occasionally, revealing glimpses of concern and indignation. An undercurrent of retribution flowed through everything. For years, Ridley and Thompson had flaunted their power, secure in the belief that no one would hold them accountable. Now they found themselves cornered under the blinding light of national attention. The disgrace they had tried to inflict on Elise was boomeranging back upon them, tenfold. Their credibility was in shambles, and whispers of criminal charges against them, perjury, civil rights violations, grew louder. Elise didn't revel in their downfall. She was too aware of the bigger picture. They were just the tip of an iceberg. Changes in policy, accountability measures, and real cultural shifts within policing. Those would be the true victories. Still, she couldn't deny a sense of closure. If even two corrupt officers could be exposed, it would send a message to others that no one was beyond the reach of justice. As the trial neared its conclusion, the city of Westbridge braced for the verdict. Were the officers guilty of misconduct, lying under oath, and racially motivated abuse of power? Or would the system, flawed as it was, somehow shield them again? One thing was certain: The illusions propping them up had shattered. The final judgment loomed, promising to set a precedent for how the country at large might deal with similar injustices in the future. In the packed courtroom, all eyes were on Ridley and Thompson as the final days of the trial unfolded. Evidence of their misconduct had piled so high that their own counsel was running out of defenses. Rumors swirled that the officers were considering a plea deal, some arrangement to avoid the harshest penalties. Yet their pride still clung to the hope they might walk away with minimal consequences. On the stand for a second time, Officer Thompson appeared rattled. Gone was the swaggering confidence. Perspiration trickled down his temple as Gregory methodically replayed the damning surveillance footage, cross-referencing it with Thompson's earlier contradictory statements. The tension was palpable, each silent second magnifying the sense that the walls were closing in on him. Ridley watched this unfold, jaw tight and lips pressed into a thin line. He had long been the alpha between the two, but now the cracks in his tough facade were unmistakable. During a brief recess, his own attorney confronted him in a corner of the courtroom, whispering urgently. If they refused to show any remorse, they risked being crucified by public opinion and possibly the law. They had become a liability not just to themselves, but to the entire Westbridge PD. When proceedings resumed, something unexpected happened. Ridley rose to speak, requesting a moment to address the court. Judge Whitfield, clearly intrigued, allowed it. The veteran cop cleared his throat, looking around the room. His eyes finally landed on Elise, and he hesitated, as if grappling with a profound internal struggle. I want to say something, Ridley began, voice uneven. I've been a police officer for nearly 30 years. I've always tried to do my job. But I see now that I've made mistakes, big mistakes. He turned slightly toward Elise, though he couldn't bring himself to look her in the eye for more than a second at a time. Miss Morgan, I'm sorry, He paused, swallowing hard. The silence was excruciating. The man who once mocked Elise openly, who believed she was just another insignificant citizen, now fumbled for words. I'm sorry I handled things the way I did. I was wrong, and I apologize. A gasp fluttered through the gallery. Thompson, seated beside his partner, looked stunned. Elise studied Ridley's face. Was this genuine contrition or a calculated move? She decided that while she couldn't read the man's heart, his words still carried weight. This was a moment in which an emblem of power was forced to acknowledge wrongdoing. Judge Whitfield motioned for Ridley to be seated, but not before Thompson also stood, clearing his throat. Your Honor, he said, voice cracking slightly. I apologize as well. To Miss Morgan, we messed up. At first, no one spoke. Then Gregory nodded softly, and Elise remained composed, meeting Thompson's gaze. She offered a dignified inclination of her head, acknowledging their words without endorsing them wholeheartedly. A public apology was a far cry from justice, yet it was a step. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, albeit subtly. Some spectators looked relieved, others remained skeptical. Reverend Tillman, sitting in the gallery, breathed a measured sigh, while Karen Donahue furiously took notes, ready to pen an article about the dramatic reversal she'd just witnessed. The apology didn't erase the lies told on the stand, nor the racially charged remarks. Still, it laid bare the tension between personal remorse and systematic abuse. Even if these officers were sincere, the damage extended beyond them. The city had to grapple with why it allowed men like Ridley and Thompson to act with impunity for so long. Elise listened to their apologies with a calm expression. Thank you, she said softly, her voice carrying in the hushed courtroom. I accept your apology, but that doesn't absolve the harm you've done. Let's hope this sparks real change. Her words hung in the air, an unspoken challenge to the entire system. As the courtroom recessed for the day, reporters scrambled for statements, and the public braced for the next phase. Contrition or not, accountability was now inevitable. On the final day of the trial, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. The jury filed in, faces solemn, bearing the weight of days of testimony and revelations. Elise sat quietly beside Gregory, eyes forward, posture dignified. Opposite them, Ridley and Thompson seemed to have aged years in the span of the trial. Their once defiant demeanors had deflated. Judge Whitfield addressed the court. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" she asked. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with determined features, rose and handed a slip of paper to the bailiff. After a tense pause, she read the words that would determine the outcome. On the key charges of false arrest and filing false reports, the jury found Ridley and Thompson guilty. They also faced potential additional charges, including civil rights violations, pending the outcome of federal investigations that Elise's team would lead. A wave of hushed exclamations rippled through the gallery. Some spectators smiled, others allowed tears to slip down their cheeks. Ridley and Thompson bowed their heads, their attorneys placing conciliatory hands on their shoulders. There would be sentencing to come, but the message was clear. Their actions had consequences. Judge Whitfield's voice held steady authority. "Officers Ridley and Thompson, a date for sentencing will be set. Until then, you are remanded to limited custody with electronic monitoring. Given the gravity of the charges, your continued service on the police force is no longer feasible. I trust the department will act accordingly. Court is adjourned." She banged her gavel, and the echo seemed to underscore a monumental shift. Elise shut her eyes briefly, exhaling the tension that had built up over the weeks. Gregory patted her arm in quiet celebration. Immediately, the gallery erupted into a swirl of activity. Reporters clamored to get quotes, cameras flashed incessantly, and the bailiffs did their best to maintain order. Ridley and Thompson were escorted out through a side door, heads lowered. They had stepped into the courtroom believing themselves untouchable. Now they were leaving as convicted criminals, with tarnished reputations and uncertain futures. Community members gathered around Elise offering gratitude and congratulations. Even Reverend Tillman, who'd watched quietly, approached her with moist eyes. "Thank you, Miss Morgan," he said, voice trembling. "You've shown everyone that justice can still prevail." Karen Donahue, the columnist, offered a surprisingly warm handshake. "I've been critical of federal overreach in the past," she admitted. "But you showed me there are times federal oversight is exactly what's needed." Elise accepted their thanks gracefully. She was relieved not just for her personal vindication, but for what this verdict represented. For too long, stories like hers ended with the officer's word being taken as gospel, leaving victims unheard and unprotected. Today's verdict, while not erasing decades of injustice, was a beacon of hope. Gregory stood nearby, face beaming with tired pride. Tiana, Elise's assistant, discreetly pressed a phone into Elise's hand. "It's Deputy Secretary Lawson," she whispered. "He wants to congratulate you." Elise smiled. She'd nearly forgotten the larger world that awaited her beyond Westbridge. With the trial concluded, she could now direct her attention to ensuring that systemic reforms followed the verdict. This was only one battle in a greater war against discrimination and corruption. But for that moment, Elise allowed herself to savor the rare victory. The city of Westbridge, battered by scandal, had taken a stand for justice, and in doing so, had given the nation a reason to believe in the power of accountability and truth. In the weeks following the trial, Westbridge found itself under intense public scrutiny. The Westbridge Police Department announced a full overhaul of its complaint review system, promising external oversight and transparency. A federal task force, overseen in part by Elise herself, began investigating the department's leadership. Heads rolled, and retirements were hastily arranged for high-ranking officials who had stonewalled complaints. The old guard gave way to new, more diverse leadership. Ridley and Thompson awaited formal sentencing. Their attorneys pursued every legal angle possible, but the evidence was overwhelming. Meanwhile, the city braced for a civil lawsuit from Elise, one that aimed to secure financial restitution, not for herself, but for the underrepresented communities harmed by police misconduct. She planned to channel any award into social programs that supported youth and addressed racial disparities in law enforcement. Elise's story captured the national spotlight. Interviews and articles highlighted her role in shining a light on systemic corruption. Many media outlets treated her like a celebrity, but Elise reframed each interview to focus on the broader issue of reform. "I'm just one person," she would say. "There are countless others who've endured the same injustice with no recourse. They deserve to be heard too." At City Hall, a special ceremony took place to honor local civil rights activists who had long fought against injustice, often in obscurity. Reverend Tillman received a commendation, and Karen Donahue, previously an outspoken critic of activist movements, gave a heartfelt speech apologizing for her naive views. The moment was fraught with symbolism, people from opposite ends of the ideological spectrum uniting around the recognition that something had to change. Gregory Holtz, after the trial, found his law office inundated with messages of support. The aging attorney, nearing retirement, joked that he might never retire if cases like Elise's kept surfacing. "We've only scratched the surface," he confided to Elise one afternoon. "Every day, more victims come forward, emboldened by your example." Tiana, Elise's ever-faithful assistant, coordinated resources from Homeland Security to aid Westbridge's path to reform. She also played a significant role in assembling a coalition of local nonprofits, educators, and business leaders, collectively dedicated to rejuvenating the city's marginalized neighborhoods. The synergy was remarkable. Where cynicism once reigned, a spirit of hope and communal effort took root. One evening, Elise returned to the now familiar street where her confrontation with Ridley and Thompson had occurred. The elderly resident whose home was raided greeted her with grateful tears. The neighborhood kids, once scared to go outside in fear of harassment, rode their bikes freely. Street murals began to appear on old walls, depicting images of unity and justice, and as Elise looked around, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The city still had mountains to climb, but at least it was moving in the right direction. Back in her vehicle, Elise found a moment to reflect. She had come to Westbridge as a visitor, only to be thrown into a fight for her dignity and freedom. But from the ashes of that ordeal, something transformative had emerged. For her, for the city, and potentially for the nation. She would continue her duties as head of Homeland Security, but she vowed never to forget the lesson of Westbridge, that ordinary people, fueled by truth and courage, could topple even the most deeply entrenched injustices. She leaned back against the seat, scanning the twinkling skyline. The ride ahead might be long, but the engine of change was finally running, and that, Elise thought with a determined smile, was a road worth traveling, no matter where it led. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of truth and redemption. We witnessed how arrogance and prejudice crumbled before the unwavering resolve of one woman, Elise Morgan, who refused to bow to injustice. This story sheds light on a critical truth. No matter one's rank or uniform, no one is above accountability. And just as importantly, we see the power of solidarity, where diverse voices unite to hold institutions to their highest calling. If this story moved you, we invite you to take action. Reflect on the injustices you see around you, support those who fight for fairness, and continue pushing for change, no matter how small the step. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you help spread stories that inspire hope, courage, and the transformative power of justice. Together, we can ensure every voice is heard and every life is valued.